He was called Thomas Reed, though for years no one had spoken his name out loud. In a small town in the Midwest, the kind of place where everyone once knew everyone, Thomas slowly became invisible. He lived in a narrow apartment above a closed hardware store, the windows always dark, the curtains never moving. People passed the building every day without looking up. Some vaguely remembered that an old man lived there, but memory without action is another form of forgetting. Thomas had once been a husband, a father, a skilled machinist at a factory that no longer existed. Life had not collapsed all at once, it eroded him slowly. His wife died after a long illness, the kind that drains not only savings but hope. His son moved away, then stopped calling, not out of cruelty but because time, distance, and unresolved pain built quiet walls between them. When the factory shut down, Thomas lost not just income but identity. Days blurred into each other. Weeks passed without conversation. He began to believe that if he disappeared entirely, the world would continue unchanged. Each morning, Thomas walked to the same diner, ordered the cheapest coffee, and sat by the window. The waitresses changed shifts, the menu prices rose, but no one noticed him enough to ask how he was. He left small tips even when he couldn't afford them, as if paying rent to remain in public space. At night, he returned to his apartment, listening to the hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of traffic. Loneliness is not always loud, sometimes it is the steady absence of sound. On colder days, his joints ached, and he skipped meals to save money for heat. Pride kept him from asking for help. He told himself others needed it more. Over time, even that thought faded, replaced by a numb acceptance that this was how things ended, quietly, unnoticed. One winter, Thomas slipped on the icy stairs outside his building and fell hard. Pain shot through his hip, sharp and immediate. He lay there for several minutes, snow collecting on his coat, watching the sky turn a dull gray. People walked past, some glancing, some not, assuming someone else would help or that he was drunk or that it wasn't their problem. Eventually, a man did call an ambulance, but he never gave his name. At the hospital, Thomas was treated efficiently and discharged just as efficiently. No visitors came. The nurse asked if someone would pick him up. Thomas shook his head, she sighed, not unkindly, and arranged a taxi. Back in his apartment, healing alone felt heavier than the injury itself. That was when he stopped going to the diner. Days passed where the only human voice he heard came from the television. He began to skip mornings altogether, sleeping through hunger. The mirror reflected a man he barely recognized, thinner, eyes dulled by resignation. Somewhere deep inside, a small voice still wanted to matter, but it had learned not to speak too loudly. The world, it seemed, had already decided he was finished. The next part of his life began on an ordinary afternoon, without ceremony or warning. A young woman named Emily knocked on his door by mistake. She was new to town, a social work graduate doing community outreach, and she had mixed up apartment numbers while delivering flyers about a free health clinic. When Thomas opened the door, surprised by the sound, she saw more than just an old man. She noticed the stale air, the bare shelves, the way he held onto the doorframe as if it were the only solid thing left. She apologized, handed him the flyer anyway, and smiled. It was a simple smile, but it lingered longer than expected. Before leaving, she asked if he was doing okay. Thomas almost said yes out of habit. Instead, something in her tone made him pause. "I'm managing," he said. Quietly. Emily returned the next week, this time on purpose. She brought a small bag of groceries, claiming she had extras. Thomas protested weakly, but she brushed it off, sitting at his small table as if it were the most natural thing in the world. She listened more than she spoke. When he mentioned his old job, she asked questions, genuinely curious. No one had asked him about his past in years. The words came slowly at first, then faster, like water finding a crack. Over time, her visits became routine. She helped him apply for assistance programs he didn't know existed, arranged physical therapy for his hip, and made sure he ate properly. But more than that, she treated him like someone whose life still had value. Kindness has a strange way of awakening parts of us we thought were gone. Thomas began to look forward to the days again. He shaved, cleaned his apartment, even fixed a broken chair using skills his hands still remembered. Emily introduced him to a community center where seniors gathered. The first day, he almost turned back, convinced he didn't belong. But a man there recognized the factory name Thomas mentioned and struck up a conversation. Shared memories bridged years of isolation. Slowly, Thomas's world expanded from one room to several streets, from silence to shared laughter. One afternoon, Emily encouraged him to write a letter to his son. Not to demand anything, she said, just to say he was thinking of him. Thomas hesitated for days, afraid of rejection. When he finally wrote, his hands shook. Weeks passed with no reply. Then, one evening, the phone rang. His son's voice was cautious, emotional, filled with regret and relief. They talked for hours, awkwardly at first, then more freely. Old wounds did not disappear, but they began to heal. Thomas was not suddenly young or wealthy or free from pain. His life remained simple, limited in many ways. But it was no longer invisible. People at the community center greeted him by name. Emily continued to visit, though less often now, proud of the independence he was rebuilding. On warm mornings, Thomas returned to the diner, not to hide by the window, but to sit at the counter and talk. The same town that once passed him by now held small spaces where he belonged. He sometimes thought about how close he had come to disappearing entirely, not through death, but through neglect. What saved him was not a grand gesture or a miracle, but one person choosing to notice, to care, to act. Kindness remembered him when the world had forgotten, and in being remembered, Thomas learned to remember himself.